Hello and welcome back again. This is Alex from Red Star Radio doing another video for the Workers' Party, looking this time at a scandal that's been all over the internet and independent media sites in recent weeks, or the recent week to be more precise, which is, as you can see from the image on my right, it's the scandal of Paul Mason, the man whom many on the left saw as some sort of free-range, freelance Corbynista journalist who presented himself as one of the major high-profile media advocates for Corbyn over the last 6 years, who was never out of the press, stating that Corbyn was going to end neoliberalism. And yet at the same time, we know for a number of years now, he was in secret plotting against Corbyn, plotting to replace Corbyn, with Clive Lewis being one of his favoured candidates back in 2018. And now is revealed by an investigation into him, thanks to a bunch of leaked emails by Kit Clarenberg and Max Blumenthal of the Grey Zone, that Mason has been actively seeking the assistance of the British state in trying to get independent media voices who dissent from the line of the British government on the war in Ukraine, on NATO expansion, and on the role of the US and British imperialism in the world. He's been seeking to get such people censored, deplatformed, and have their means of making money taken away. And this was, of course, not really much of a surprise to some who followed Mason's career closely, but it was a surprise for many people who regarded themselves as Mason's political allies, collaborators, and even friends. Because, as was just demonstrated on his rather insane arrow chart that you can see on the graphic there, Mason was connecting all kinds of people to what he saw as a vast conspiracy emanating from Beijing and the Kremlin, including people like Novara Media, including Labour MPs like Zara Sultana, including, of course, Jeremy Corbyn, who is at the centre of that flowchart, along with George Galloway, of course. And Mason is making the point in that rather insane set of graphics that he produced that all of these people are carriers of Russian and Chinese influence into what he thinks of as the British Labour movement. And what I want to talk about today is not so much the revelations from the emails, because they are all very well documented in the Grey Zone article, which if you haven't read already, then be sure to go and do so. What I want to talk to you about is how none of this really is coming much of a surprise to anybody who was paying attention to the actual political positions of Mason over the last 6 years. Because if you actually read the things that he stuck up on his Medium blog, the things he wrote in his Guardian column, or in his columns for the New Statesman, or his endless tweets, you'll find that what Mason has been doing for the last 6 years is basically conducting a information war on behalf of, really, interests within the British ruling class. And he's been doing that by taking the talking points and the policy points that would be perfectly favourable to the British Foreign Office, to the US State Department, to MI6 and the CIA. What he does is he takes those talking points and those policies and he dresses them up in left language, and he sometimes using Marxist terminology, and sometimes he even calls himself a revolutionary. But he's been essentially making the points that the British government would find perfectly agreeable, and he's been making those to a left-wing audience in leftist language. And he's one of many people that have done so and do so today. Carry the water for the British and US governments and do it in a language that appeals to the left. And as I said, he's been doing this for quite some time. I want to go back and look at several pieces of writing that Mason put out since 2016, when he left Channel 4 to formally become independent. And if we look at them, we can see clearly that this collaboration or attempted collaboration with state forces to suppress independent voices in the media and anybody on the left who he regards as suspect or maybe subject to Russian and Chinese influence, the fact that he would be trying to run those people into the state shouldn't be really a surprise. So let's take a look at what Mason's actually advocated for over the last 6 years. We'll start with this. This is from an article on Mason's Medium blog. It's still there. You can go and read it. He hasn't wiped himself from the internet entirely as yet. But this is on defence spending, and this is on the kind of defence policy that Mason thinks that a Labour government under Jeremy Corbyn should have adopted. And he talks about, in the first part of this excerpt, the need to raise defence spending to 2% of GDP. But the more interesting part is this, point 3, where he calls for a Labour government under Jeremy Corbyn to commit to a common European defence strategy. And he says it's nonsense for the Brexiteers to go on complaining about a European army now. If you want to do forward defence of the Baltics, with Trump sending nice messages to Putin from the Oval Office, you have to increase coordination with the big militaries of Europe. That means Poland, Germany, France, and in the south, Greece. So let's pause there to take a look at what Mason's actually advocating for. Mason's advocating for the European army, which many of the pro-EU people in the referendum campaign denied was a factor, denied was going to exist. Mason's there advocating for it. And why is he advocating for it? Well, he's advocating for it for the specific purposes of getting British forces deployed to Eastern Europe to, as he puts it, or as he sees it, counteract the Russians. So essentially, he's calling for a Labour government that would have been led by Corbyn to commit to a military escalation in Eastern Europe. And we can see from the current situation in Ukraine how well that policy has gone, because that policy has been pursued, military escalation in Eastern Europe, by successive Conservative governments from Cameron to May to Johnson, and before them by Blair and by Brown, who oversaw the NATO expansion. So there's a man supposedly on the left. He calls himself a socialist at various points. He even calls himself a revolutionary, advocating for the same defence policy, or really a policy of offence, a policy of warmongering, of imperialism, that successive Conservative and Blairite governments have committed to already. And what else does he say in that particular excerpt? Well, if we have a look at it again, we can see that he echoes the talking point that was come up with by the American intelligence services, the idea that Trump was somehow in the pocket of Putin, which has been proven by many independent journalists in America and in Britain now to have been a complete lie. It was an intelligence service plot against Trump. No matter what you think about Trump, and my own opinion, he's not favourable politically to the man. It was the case that from the earliest stages of his presidency, that large elements of the American intelligence services, of the secret state, chose to conduct a conspiracy against the sitting elected president of the United States in a way that is totally against the US Constitution and against the most basic aspects of the rule of law. And Mason is there echoing these points. Now, that seems like it's quite minor because it's just a throwaway line. But of course, Mason bought into the conspiracy theory, the elite conspiracy theory that was the idea that Trump was collaborating with Russia. And he bought into it for the same reason that the theory was come up with in the first place. The intelligence services of the United States cooked up this theory in order to stop any improvement of relations between the United States and Russia, in order to actually force an escalation of tensions with Russia. That's why these people in the US came up with this theory. That's why people like Mason support it. He supports that conspiracy theory because he supports, as he makes clear in this article and others will go on to look at, an escalation of tensions between US, Britain, and the rest of Europe and the Russian Federation. Now, how is any of that in the interests of the British working class? It manifestly is not. And this shows that Mason is advocating for points that are completely in line, as I said at the opening of this video, with the State Department, the CIA, the Foreign Office, and MI6. And he goes on to do this time and time again. Now, this is again an article from later on in 2016. And here he's talking about what policies a Labour government led by Jeremy Corbyn should adopt when it comes to foreign and defence issues. And here we can see again, though, what he's talking about. and he's coming up with a series of untruths, a series of lies that he's basing his policy recommendations on. So let's go through it. When it comes to conventional security, Mason says, there are serious threats facing the UK, both from Islamist terrorism and from an autocratic regime in Russia that is playing a destabilization game in Ukraine, Syria, and East Europe. Now, let's pause there because he's come up with a series of lies. The first lie is that he makes the assumption that the British government is actually engaged in the business of fighting hardline, reactionary Islamist terrorism. That is not the case. As we know from the British government's actions in Libya, in Syria, and elsewhere, the British government actually is in a long-term alliance with these forces. They used them in Libya to destroy the government led by Muammar Gaddafi. They are using them in Syria and have been using them for the past decade to attack and trying to destroy the government led by President Assad. Now, how do we know this? We know this because various American officials of the former Obama administration admitted as much. Hillary Clinton admitted that they were on the same side as al-Qaeda in Syria. John Kerry, in testimony to Congress, admitted that that the US benefited from the advances made by ISIS, because the more ISIS advanced, the more pressure was put on the Assad government, and that favored the American policy of regime change. And that's before we get to this vast arms supplying campaign that the Americans engaged in, Operation Timber Sycamore, as it was called, to supply the so-called moderate rebels, in reality Islamic fundamentalists, with huge amounts of weaponry, as they are now doing the same job in Ukraine. And this proves that Mason is lying when he advocates the idea that the British government is somehow engaged in a campaign of opposition to the Islamic fundamentalists. They are not. And just as a side note, but an important one, the most deadly terrorist attack on British soil that took place in recent years was, of course, the bombing that took place in the Manchester Evening News Arena in 2017. And this was carried out by a man who had actually fought in a group backed by the British government in Libya. He fought as part of the campaign to destroy the Libyan government of Muammar Gaddafi. So, and then this man was given a ride back to the UK on a British naval vessel. So, at the very least, the government is complicit with the crimes of these people overseas, and at worst, they are directly conspiring with them to carry out regime change operations overseas. So Mason's idea that somehow the British government is opposing these characters is a joke. So let's look at the rest of what he claims in this article. So we see here that what Mason is also advocating for is a further confrontation with Russia. He describes Russia in the same terms that somebody like Obama did, someone like former American Secretary of State Madeleine Albright did. It says it's an autocratic regime that is playing a destabilization game in Ukraine, Syria, and East Europe. Well, again, let's pause there because it's worth just looking at exactly what Mason is advocating for here. He's coming up with several lies again. He's first of all saying that Russia is playing a destabilization game in Ukraine. Now, he's writing this in 2016. It was only 2 years before this, 2014, that the US and Britain were clearly and obviously caught in a regime change operation in Ukraine. Infamously, one of the US diplomats, Victoria Nuland, was caught on an audio saying F the EU. The US was openly backing the various forces that were aligning to overthrow the elected government of Yanukovych. The US was openly aligning with the far-right forces and the neo-fascist forces in Ukraine, led by the likes of the Azov Battalion and IDAR and other hard-right, ultra-right-wing groups. The US was backing these groups. The US backed the overthrow of the Ukrainian government. If that's not destabilization, then I don't know what is. Clearly, Mason doesn't regard that as worth commenting on. And as for destabilization in Syria, again, the Russian involvement in Syria only came after almost 4 years of continuous warfare backed by the US and Britain through their Islamic fundamentalist proxies. So it is, again, the US and the British governments who are engaged in these destabilization operations in the countries that Mason mentions. And as for Eastern Europe, well, the destabilization in Eastern Europe has come through the fact that NATO has expanded relentlessly over the last 25 years almost now, and has done so with no attempt at negotiation, no attempt at coming up with a reasonable European-wide security framework that could be negotiated with the Russian government, even though the Russian government did make suggestions of such a security framework. Now, to not mention any of that, to just pretend that it is somehow the Russians who are engaging in these destabilization operations and that there is no role being played at all by the United States and Britain, makes Mason a liar. And he does this time and time and time again, over and over again, to advocate for policy positions that, as I've said, would be the same as those held by the Foreign Office and the State Department. Let's look at it again. So he says that a future Labour government should ban arms sales to despots like Saudi Arabia. Now, many would agree with that. But, of course, Mason, infamously, in a recent video with Owen Jones, of all people, wouldn't commit to making the same measures imply to Labour MPs who backed Saudi Arabia as he would to Labour MPs who refused to back NATO. Mason thinks that Labour MPs who refuse to back the NATO war in Ukraine should be thrown out. He won't make the same demand for the many Labour MPs who back continued British arms sales and economic ties to the theocratic regime in Saudi Arabia. Now, why will Mason not make that demand? Well, it's because Mason, as you can see already, is lining his foreign policy or his desired foreign policy objectives and defense policy objectives up completely with those that would be acceptable to any British government led by any Tory or Blairite leader. It's because Mason, essentially, again, is using left language to justify imperialism, to draw people who might be on the left into supporting imperialist positions, and he's using a left way of expressing it in order to trick people, in order to con people. And he's lying about what is going on in Ukraine, in Syria, in Eastern Europe, and everywhere else. And he does this time and time again. Let's look at the same piece of writing. He said a Labour government should never again blindly support Israel's wars against the Palestinians. Now, we'd probably all agree with that. But what has Mason done in reality? Mason, in reality, backed the anti-Semitism lies thrown at Jeremy Corbyn, as did a lot of the others on the left. And he says the Labour government should disavow Cameron's policy of a military with global reach in favour of one that defends us against terrorism and takes responsibility for stabilising Europe's borders with Russia. Now, as I've said already, the principal source of Islamic terrorism over the last decade has actually been its funding and arming via the British and the United States governments and their allies in the Middle East. And as for stabilising Europe's borders against Russia, well, Mason is advocating for military expansion and the deployment of British forces in Eastern Europe, the same policy that has actually been pursued by the British government for over 25 years and has caused the current war in Ukraine. He also says Labour should uphold the military covenant, remain in NATO, meet the 2% of GDP spending commitment on defence, that is, and remain a member of the UN Security Council. Our national security strategy has to be serious, coherent, and command a broad consensus across society. Well, let's think about that for a moment, because Mason comes back to this point over and over again. He comes back to the point that Labour has to be credible on defence. Well, what is a credible defence policy? What is a credible defence policy that would actually benefit the working class in Britain? Well, it's not sticking British troops thousands of miles away on the borders of Russia. It's having a defence policy that actually defends our own country, not one that seeks to stick British forces far away, trying to aggressively pursue the policies demanded by imperialism against another person's country. See, what Mason's doing here is exactly the same trick that the Tories do and that the likes of Keir Starmer do, which is pretending that defending our own country has to somehow come at the expense of assaulting other peoples. That is a lie. That is not a necessary thing, unless, of course, you are an imperialist, which Mason quite clearly is. And so this is Mason on defence and foreign policy. This is a man who is completely in line with the policies of the British and US governments, and often their most aggressive and belligerently imperialist sections. But let's turn to another key element of policy, another big political controversy that's raged over the last 6 years now, since the vote in 2016, and that is the question of Brexit. And again, Mason shows himself to be completely in line with the thinking of the British ruling class on this issue, but he uses left language to make his point, to draw people in. So let's read from this article that came from this article. It's from one of his Guardian columns from 2018. And this is when the Brexit negotiations are ongoing. And of course, the Labour Party, in the general election of 2017, had gone into it with a position on Brexit that said that they supported the outcome of the referendum, they accepted it, but that they would get a better deal than the Conservative Party would, which was a position that was at least viable and credible, and that actually respected a democratic decision that was powered by the votes of the British working class. So he says in this excerpt from his article in 2018 that my position on Brexit has always been a compromise, Mason writes, between principle and what's needed to assemble a voting coalition to put a left-wing Labour government in power. If it had been possible to achieve a left-wing Brexit, I would have supported it. The Lisbon Treaty is a machine for destroying jobs and growth and is stoking disillusion in democracy. But the real-world forces pushing Brexit in 2016 were always those of xenophobic nationalism, and their project was an even more deregulated and polluted Britain. So I campaigned on Remain and Reform. Now, let's take this rather strange set of words apart and see what the actual meaning is. So he says that he needed to assemble a voting coalition to put a left-wing Labour government in power. That's true. And if it had been possible to achieve a left-wing Brexit, he would have supported it. Now, a left-wing Brexit in 2016, it's true, was not on offer. That was not what was being discussed. What was being discussed in the referendum was the simple act of voting to leave the European Union. Now, when you are presented, as we were in 2016, with the ruling class of this country opening the door to us potentially defeating them in a democratic vote, then that is something that the working class movement, that any serious socialist should embrace. Because if we remember back to the campaign of 2016, all of the most powerful forces in British society were on the side of Remain. The City of London was mostly on the side of Remain. All the major big business groups were on the side of Remain. The overwhelming majority of politicians were on the side of Remain. There was even an intervention by former President, now Barack Obama, on the side of Britain staying in the European Union. Like the major imperialist forces in the world were in favour of Britain staying in the EU. All the most powerful forces in the country were in favour of Britain staying in the EU. And yet Mason, and unfortunately Jeremy Corbyn at the time, went into the 2016 referendum peddling the fiction of Remain and Reform. The idea was that they were going to vote Remain and get a Remain vote pushed through, and then would push for reform of the EU. That is always, and has always, been a myth. It's always been a dishonest position, because to reform the EU, to make it some sort of social democratic paradise that the left Remainers dreamed of, is an impossibility. Because to get the reforms that Corbyn and people like Mason said that they were in favour of, would have necessitated the agreement of all of the European countries. And the French and the Germans and the rulers of those countries, who have got a very large economic interest in things remaining exactly as they are, they were never going to agree to that, nor were any of the American satellite governments in Eastern Europe. So to say that you were in favour of remaining and reforming is a joke. What you are in favour of is remaining. What you are in favour of is remaining at all costs, which is what Mason goes on to advocate for. And so this, he then accurately says the Lisbon Treaty is a machine for destroying jobs and growth and stoking disillusion in democracy. That's correct. But he then refuses to take the opportunity to do anything about that. He then basically goes into the same old lies, dismissing Brexit as just a racist and xenophobic conspiracy, despite the fact that all the most powerful forces in British society, where most racism and prejudice actually is generated from the ruling class, were in favour of remaining in the EU. And so again, he aligns himself with the most powerful groups in British society, he aligns himself with the political establishment, he aligns himself with big business. And that is, again, the essence of Mason's true politics, which is to line himself up with the most aggressive elements of big business and used leftist language in order to do so. And let's see what else Mason has advocated for when it comes to Brexit. Now, his position actually got worse as time went on, as we can see. This, again, is from later in 2018. It's again from his Guardian column. And in this, he is advocating for that most dreaded term, the so-called Progressive Alliance. Now, I'll go on to talk about what that is. And here, Mason says, to make it work nationally will not be easy. He's referring here to his desire for a so-called Progressive Alliance. Everything depends on Labour. Basically, its choice is either to lead an informal Progressive Alliance or to become one. The first thing Labour's front bench has to do is to commit immediately and unequivocally to fight any general election called before Britain leaves the EU on a remain and transform ticket. Now, forget the transform, as we've just been through. There is no possibility of transforming the EU from within. That is always a lie. So what he's actually fighting for is remain at all costs. He's just in favour of remaining in the EU. And I'll give him credit that he's not stupid. He knows that reforming the EU is an impossibility. He's just a liar. So, what is he talking about, though, when it comes to this thing about a progressive alliance? Now, I remember this at the time, because at the time I was in the Labour Party, and this came up a lot with, shall we say, the soft leftists, people who were influenced by characters like Mason. And what they were arguing for, and what Mason was arguing for, was an alliance with the Liberal Democrats, the Green Party, the Welsh nationalists and the Scottish nationalists, based on the idea that they were going to come together to defeat Brexit. So think about that for a moment. Combining together with the Liberal Democrats, who were the most prominent out of all these, even though they didn't have many MPs left at the time. They'd been rightly punished by the electorate for being in coalition with the Conservative Party for 5 years. But think about what the meaning of this is. His call for an alliance with these forces, this idea of the Progressive Alliance, he is echoing in this demand, specifically, the language of Tony Blair. And I'll go into why. Blair in the 1990s, immediately before the general election of 1997, was in favour of a coalition with the Liberal Democrats, led at the time by Paddy Ashdown. Now, why was he in favour of this? It wasn't because he actually thought he wasn't going to get a big majority. He got a bigger majority than he expected, but all the polls pointed to a heavy Labour victory in 1997. What Blair and his allies were after was an alliance with the Liberal Democrats to, as Blair put it, unite the progressive forces in Britain. And Blair was quite explicit over and over again, specifically before and after the 97 election, that he thought that the very act of founding the Labour Party back in the 1900s was a mistake. And Blair said that it was a mistake because it divided the progressive forces in Britain. He was arguing that the working class essentially should have remained bound to the old Liberal Party, that no party of Labour should ever have been developed. And of course, Blair, by expressing that, is expressing the wishes and desires of the capitalist class themselves. The rulers of Britain hated the idea that the working class ever got any slither of political influence within their system as they see it. Even the very inadequate way in which the Labour Party reflected some working class demands back 100 years ago, 50 years ago, was too much for the ruling class of Britain. They didn't want any political influence to be exercised by the working class, no matter how flawed, no matter how imperfect. And they wanted that working class influence that was expressed via the trade union movement pushed out of the Labour Party and pushed out of the political system altogether. And through the Thatcher, Major and Blair years, they got a lot of what they were looking for, in that the working class was defeated industrially, and was then pushed out of the political influence. And what Blair wanted was a merger with the Liberal Democrats to finally dilute the influence of the union movement to the point where it played the same role as it does in the Democratic Party in the United States, which is, if you look at the role that the American Labor Federation, the the AFL-CIO, what their equivalent of the TUC has in terms of their influence in the Democratic Party is the ability to sign checks and nothing else. In other words, this merger, this hybrid that Blair wanted, would still get trade union money, but with the trade unions able to insist on nothing, even less than the tiny portion of influence they had left. They had left under Blair, and they have left now under Starmer. They didn't even want that. And so Mason is echoing that demand. And now, again, I don't think Paul Mason is a stupid man. I think he's a duplicitous, lying, traitorous scumbag. And he's echoing these points, and he's still making these points up until recently in his columns, that Labour needs a progressive alliance. Labour needs to collaborate with the Scottish Nationalists, the Greens and the Liberals. Well, look at the record of the SNP in government in Scotland if you want to know what they're all about, and look at the record of the Green Party at Brighton Council if you want to know what they're all about. Or look at the record of the Green Party in Ireland, or look at the record of the Green Party in Germany. You can see clearly that this is no friend of the working class. In fact, they are a bitter enemy of the working class, just as the Liberals are, just as the SNP are, just as Plaid Cymru is, and just as Paul Mason is. And the reason why he's advocating for this, and he keeps advocating for this, is that he wants to see the remaining traces, any trace of working class influence in the political system, pushed out. Because Paul Mason hates, loathes and despises the working class of Britain, and regards them, as he says in his columns over and over again, he regards working class people as backward-looking, reactionary, racist, for voting for Brexit. He hates and fears the working class, just the same way that any other member of the ruling class would, and he wants to see working class influence completely pushed out of politics. And that is the essence of what Paul Mason is really all about. And he further underlined this point by appearing with various characters who are, of course, confirmed to be bitter enemies of the working class. Take a look at this. This is from 2019. There's Paul Mason smirking on the right. Next to him is Andrew, Lord Adonis. And then on the other end is, of course, first time he's been on the far left, it's Tom Watson. Now, Lord Watson. And, of course, Lord Watson of West Bromwich, or wherever he was ennobled, was made a lord for his services in relentlessly undermining and ultimately playing a part in destroying the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. Now, what's Mason doing there? That photo was taken during the 2019 European elections, when Mason was advocating openly for that so-called progressive alliance I've just been talking about, when he was collaborating with virulently anti-working class characters like Adonis, who's been in a government minister for Blair, Brown and David Cameron, and of course Tom Watson. And Mason was using that as a platform to advocate for this so-called progressive alliance. And so, again, this confirms who Mason is. This was his priority: stopping Brexit, stopping the biggest expression of working class political influence in many, many years. Because Brexit really is a question about class. And the rage with which the Remainers fought back against the Brexit vote is coming down in a large part to the fact that that vote was won via the votes of the working class. And Mason hates that as much as Tom Watson and as much as Andrew Adonis does. And again, he just confirms that this is exactly who he has always been. What was confirmed in that Grey Zone article was just that he was going even further in private. Now, again, I said at the top of the video that none of this should come as a surprise, the revelations in the Grey Zone article. And let's look at why that is, because all the things that he was advocating for in private, he was almost public about his desire for them. This is from Mason's New Statesman column, just a couple of weeks ago, just before the Grey Zone finally exposed what he was up to in private. He was advocating and writing in support of the Disinformation Governance Board, set up by the Department of Homeland Security in the United States. Now let's read from this a moment. As Mason writes, led by the 33-year-old InfoWar expert Nina Jankowicz, that's the annoying theatre kid, or overgrown theatre kid, who sings about Harry Potter and does rip-offs of Gilbert and Sullivan numbers to lie about the Hunter Biden laptop story. We'll come back to that. Mason argues it has no executive powers or capability, but is there to advise the US's domestic security agencies about counter-disinformation strategies. The move was greeted with outrage, Mason says. The disinformation websites led the charge, terrorizing and ridiculing Jankowicz, who, being educated, female and feminist, fell into their prime target category. So again, he's doing his usual smear job here, saying that the only reason that people objected to the setting up of a censorship organization was because, oh, well, you're all just terrible sexists. Photographs and videos from her teenage to young adult life was splashed across the internet. A procession of white, male, middle-aged, anti-woke commentators labeled the organization a ministry of truth. The press joined in, from the Wall Street Journal and Fox News to the liberal Washington Post, claiming the mere existence of the board was a threat to the US's First Amendment, which guarantees free speech. Now, of course, it was a threat to the First Amendment of the US Constitution, and it was a violation of that Constitution. It was something which is deliberately designed to restrict free speech, to intimidate people, to censor people. But of course, Mason, in that article, is stating that all these things are good things. He's agreeing with the desires of even the Trump administration to actually censor the internet, to kick off independent media from the internet, to prevent the critical reporting on things like NATO. See, Mason doesn't just think that Labour MPs who criticise NATO should be kicked out of the party. He thinks that you shouldn't be able to criticise NATO at all, and that if you do, you get deplatformed, you get your ability to make a living compromised, and you lose your voice in the public sphere. That is what Mason was advocating for in that article. He also lies several times, as he always does. He says that the videos of Jankowicz doing ridiculous things were all from her teens and early 20s. That's not true. The video that got circulated the most was where she was doing this bizarre and awful sing-song about how the Hunter Biden laptop story was Russian disinformation. That was from 2 years ago. She wasn't a teen or in her early 20s then. She was in her early 30s. And what she's doing in that video is lying. Nina Jankowicz was lying about the Hunter Biden laptop story being Russian disinformation, and we know that it was a lie because now the New York Times, Washington Post, and other major American liberal media outlets have all confirmed that the Hunter Biden laptop story is real. So Jankowicz is a liar, and Mason, in defending her, is telling more lies. So, again, I'll come back to the point that I started on. Mason has been open about what he advocates for many years now. He advocates for imperialism. He advocates for increasing military tensions with Russia, most certainly. He advocates the British forces being deployed to Eastern Europe. He advocates for an escalation of the war in Ukraine. He advocates for censorship. He advocates for people who criticize NATO being kicked off social media platforms and having their content removed and having their ability to make a living damaged or removed. And he does all this using the language of the left, using the language of a mutilated form of Marxism. And he does all this in order to draw people from the left into supporting the policies of imperialism, into supporting the policies of the United States government and the policies of the Tory British government and the policies that Keir Starmer will pursue if he ever gets near Downing Street. Mason is not only doing that, he is an advocate for the destruction of any working class influence within the British political system. He is a bitter enemy of working class political projects. He's a bitter enemy of working class power. He is a man for whom has spent his life, his working life, in the service of the British state and its objectives. Now, whether he is, of course, an active agent of the British state or not, I do not know, but he certainly acts in and writes in and speaks in the service of their objectives. And for that reason, that this man should have been long ago cast out of any left-wing organization. He should have been completely deplatformed by anybody who claimed to be a socialist. he should have been persona non grata anywhere other than the halls of power in which he clearly belongs. And yet, until this story in the Grey Zone came out, many on the British left still welcomed Mason, still welcomed his input, thought he had ideas that were worth hearing about. And it was only when he was revealed to be grassing all of these people up to actors within the British state itself that finally these people turned their back on him. These people should question their judgment most severely, because it is clear, just from the things that Mason openly advocated for, that this man is an enemy of all progressive things that could be advocated for. He's an enemy of the British working class movement, and he is the most dangerous kind of enemy, one who dresses himself up in left language to advocate for the most reactionary, most anti-worker positions possible.